Okay, good morning, everyone. Officially, welcome to Monday. Nice to see you all here. The sun is almost shining, halfway. Good enough. Everybody got an extra hour of sleep yesterday?
No.
No?
No.
Why? Because you woke up early anyway?
Yeah.
Rookie mistake, guys. Rookie mistake. Could have got a whole. You should have heard me this morning because I woke up and I looked at the clock and it was 6:16, which is like 4 minutes before my alarm goes off. But then I realized that we hadn't changed the clock, so it was actually only 5:16. You should have heard me. I was like, "Oh, that's wonderful! Another hour." I was so happy that the clock was wrong. Yeah, it was great. That was a great realization. Okay, so where are we now? Yes. So we've finished China, right? We've left China behind. Of course, China has much more culturally to study, and historically speaking, there's another probably 12 dynasties to deal with. But of course, we don't have time to deal with all that stuff. We got to move on. So we're taking a little bit of a shift here in terms of cultures, and it might seem a little odd. But maybe if you think about going, from east to west, then this is the next culture we run into. So maybe it makes sense that way. But the next kind of culture or culture group I'd like to look at are the First Nations people from here in BC. So we've kind of gone around to the first civilizations, right, in Mesopotamia and Egypt. We've looked at India and China. And here we'll, move over to a different continent and see kind of what kinds of cultural things are happening here, right? It's a nice kind of contrast to some of the other major civilizations we've talked about. Good morning. But it's also pretty, but it's relevant to here, right? Because before people that looked like me came to Canada, this is the kind of the original culture of Canada, right? These people are the first ones here, and so their culture deserves attention and study, right? So let's dive in here. Now, maybe one of the first things I'll suggest here about First Nations people in BC and in Canada is that we're talking about a very kind of diverse group of cultures, okay? So we're not, often we talk about First Nations people as if they were just one group, right? They're all kind of in one bucket. But actually they're not, right? There are many, many different languages and sort of belief systems and subsistence strategies and technologies and all of these things that make Indigenous people across Canada and across the US and Southern America, that make them all kind of different. And they're all kind of related to each other if you go far enough back. But still all of these groups are distinct. And so I think I have another slide on it later on, but for instance, before Europeans came here, there were probably between 300 and 400 different languages spoken in Canada, all Indigenous languages. And so, that's not just one group, that's a bunch of different groups, right? So, again, there's some colorful and interesting cultural expressions here that we'll look at a little bit later. But I just wanted to start out by saying we're not looking at one group, we're looking at kind of a bunch of different groups. Okay? The other thing I'll talk about here is terminology. There's some things that Indigenous people have been called in the past, and there's things that people are called in the present. Some of them we don't really use anymore because they have kind of racist or colonial sort of feelings about them, and they're kind of yucky for that reason. Indian is kind of one of them. We didn't actually talk about it in this class, but when Christopher Columbus originally arrived here in the New World, he was looking for a route to India, and so he came ashore, saw some people, and he said, "Oh, Indians." Not Indians, not India, dummy. Sorry. not Indians, but the name kind of stuck, right? And so for a long time, indigenous people were called Indians. They have no relation to people from India, really. And again, we don't really use the term anymore because, again, it became kind of tainted with feelings of colonialism and racism, and it's kind of not cool anymore. The only exception is that it's still, unfortunately, the word Indian is still a legal term in Canada, so it's still used kind of in a legal way. So we're stuck with it that way, but we don't really use it in regular speech for the most part. Red Indian, definitely not, right? Aboriginal is kind of a questionable one. You'll hear lots of people, yeah, that's a good idea. You'll hear lots of people talk about Aboriginal people, and it's kind of okay for some people, but some indigenous people will point out the fact that, well, if you're abnormal, what are you? You are not normal, right? That's abnormal is not normal. So if you're Aboriginal, you're not original. But of course you are original. You are the first people to be here. So it's kind of, I don't know how the term kind of came to be. It's kind of not very descriptive. Some people are fine with it. Some people point out the Aboriginal thing. So I kind of don't use it very much for that reason. I try to use these three: indigenous, and so something that's indigenous is something that comes from a particular place, so that works. First Nations, that works, right? Because they are the first ones to be here. First Peoples also kind of works, right? So those are kind of the three I use. You can probably use Aboriginal as well. It's mostly okay. I wouldn't use those other two at all. Definitely not number 2, and number 1 only in a legal context, okay? So a little bit of a background here. Who are these people? Where do they come from? And how do they live their lives prior to Europeans? So before I explain this, I just want to ask you to read a little bit about some more kind of terminology and how to describe First Nations people, but it'll also give us some useful background, okay? So there is in Microsoft Teams, there is a short reading in there called First Nations Defined. It's under Files where things normally are, although we haven't actually been into that folder in a while. So open Microsoft Teams. It's in the Comparative Cultures Teams. It's under Files, and then you'll see an article saying First Nations of British Columbia, First Nations Defined. And I've got some questions at the end, which I'll maybe just put on the screen, which might make it easier for you. There we go. So I'll give you some time to read, and then we will chat, okay? There we go, it works. I'm gonna say 12 minutes. Nice. Cool? 20? You're a faster reader than that, Felicia, come on. Is it where? No, it's in, there should be a folder that says readings, I think. It's above the, do you see it? Yeah. Let me see, okay. Oh, you found it? Okay, yeah, there's a readings folder. Yes. Yes, please. Let's see, in readings. Oh. There we go. All right. Pretty good? Good, found it? Okay, those are on the way. Yeah, I think so. Does that seem doable? Yeah, I think that's okay. Oh, sorry. What's up, Victoria? Oh, nomenclature. Nomenclature is like the way we name something. Good morning. Yes.
What's the connection from India to the British colony?
There is none.
Because here it is called India Road.
Yeah, so Christopher Columbus, when he discovered North and South America, thought he was arriving in India. So he saw these people and he's like, oh, it's Indians. They're not Indians. This isn't India. He was totally wrong. But the name kind of stuck. So people, indigenous people here were continuing to call them Indians even though they have no connection to people from India at all.
Do they look like Indians?
Not to me. No.
Why does he call it
Because he didn't know. He didn't know any better. He just assumed if he sailed west from Europe that he would bump into India. And so when he bumped into land, he was like, okay, it's India. But it's not India.
It was Canada?
It was, actually, I think where he arrived was probably what is now the Dominican Republic. So down in kind of the Caribbean area. But even so, still not India.
Did you ever find out that this was India?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I he, originally came to, or like, yeah, I think he pretty quickly realized he was not where he thought he was. He didn't know where he was, but yeah, he knew, I think he figured out quickly Okay, people, let's talk about this. Now, this section here is a little bit, oh gosh, it's a little maybe more detailed than I wanted to be. I hadn't read this one in a while. I think maybe next time I'll edit it down so it's a little bit shorter, but that's okay. There are things in here which are useful to talk about. So first question here, why is it kind of preferred to refer to Canada's First Peoples as First Nations? Why does the article suggest that this might be a better way to refer to these people?
Use the primitive connotations often associated with such things as methods of original and indigenous.
Okay, so the original ways of speaking about these people as sort of native or indigenous or aboriginal or something were maybe connected to the idea that these people were, more primitive or more simple, and certainly the colonizers would have thought of them that way, but it gets rid of that. What else? Yeah, right. It says that when you say First Nations, you reaffirm, you confirm that they're the first ones, right? They were the first ones here. And I think one more piece, one more thing. Yeah, right. The using the terminology of Indian is just wrong. It really couldn't be more wrong, right? It's not accurate. And then there was one more thing about the nations part.
Emphasize that the ancestors of today's First Nations were in the region prior to the arrival.
Right? So these people were here prior to European arrival. I think that's the first thing. But what about the nation part?
Reflects original sovereign and explorer nations, essence which accentuates the multitude of distinct groups.
Yeah, it sort of speaks of that these people were originally, they had sovereignty. What does sovereignty mean? Wow. Yeah, like they kind of had political power over themselves, right? Nobody ruled over them, right? If you are sovereign or if you have sovereignty, you have the power to do what you want, right? You rule over yourself, right? That's not the case today, right? They are living in the country of Canada and the Canadian government has power over them. But before Europeans came, they were in charge of themselves, right? Nobody had power over them. So the author here is suggesting that First Nations is good because it reaffirms that these people are first. It reaffirms that they were sovereign nations before the arrival of Europeans. And it gets rid of any of those terms that are kind of associated with, again, a racism from the past, a colonialism from the past, thinking of these people as, simple or primitive or backwards or whatever, which again, the Europeans, that's what they thought of them, right? So yeah, again, there's a few other terms you can use too, but this person is arguing for First Nations, right? I guess we kind of answered number 2 already, right? The idea that Indian has a negative connotation because it's kind of associated with a racist past, and of course it's wrong, right? It's just not accurate, right? And like, how much sense does it make to continually refer to people by the wrong name, right? Imagine the first day in class, I called Kenny Kevin by mistake. And then I was like, you know what? It's just going to be easier to call him Kevin. So for the rest of the term, I call Kenny Kevin because I made a mistake once. Is that ridiculous? Is that respectful? You're thinking about changing your name to Kevin now, aren't you? No, I'm just kidding. But that's not respectful, right? If I make a mistake, you fix it, right? Especially when Kenny says, no, my name is not Kevin, right? I don't continue to call him Kevin just because I made the mistake once, right? But yet that's what's happened here, right? Difference between status and non-status Indians. Little more tricky. Okay, status Indians are registered with.
Appears on like the federal government.
Yeah, so the government has a list of status Indians, and if you are a status Indian, what does that mean? Well, there are certain benefits that come to you as for being an Indigenous person in Canada, right? To be honest, I don't think the benefits are that great. Some non-Indigenous Canadians think that, oh, Indigenous people have it so easy and they get all these benefits. They really don't. Like, they're not that great. But they do get some benefits, and so in order to get them, the government has to recognize you as an Indigenous person. And so if the government does and you're registered, you have a little card. You have a little status card from the government that says you are an Indigenous person. If you don't have the card, you can still be an Indigenous person, but the government just doesn't recognize you that way, and you don't get any of the benefits. Okay.
What does it give benefits from?
Sometimes they get extra support for education and housing. Sometimes the tax thing, as an Indigenous person, you don't have to pay income tax if you make your living on the reserve, on Indigenous land. Unfortunately, it's pretty tough to make money on Indigenous land because there's usually not much there. So almost all Indigenous people who live on a reserve, they usually leave the reserve to go to work. And so they have to pay income tax just like any of us. So, like I said, it's not that good of a benefit. If you, it's like, oh, you don't have to pay tax if you make money here, but you can't make any money here, so you have to pay tax. Thanks for nothing, right? Yeah, so there's status and non-status Indians. That's decided by the government, right? The government approves people or decides whether they have status or not. I've said the word reserve a bunch of times. What's a reserve? Yeah, so once upon a time, when the Indigenous people made a deal with the federal government, there was supposed to be land set aside for them so that they could continue their traditional way of life, which we'll talk about shortly. And those were called reserves. Yeah, I guess that's the long and short of it. The land that belongs to them and is for their use are called reserves.
Can you say refrain from using?
Can you say what?
Refrain from using?
No, they're allowed to use it. The Canadian government is also allowed to use it, but it depends. So it's not really entirely their land. It's kind of a strange. It's land set aside for their use, but the government can also use it too, or move it if they want to. So it's not really, it's their land, but not kind of the way that like you and I might own land, right? If you own land here in Vancouver, then it's yours, period, right? That's the end of it. But reserves are kind of not quite ownership. They're sort of ownership. It's oh, like metaphorically speaking? Yeah, actually that might not be a bad way to describe it. Did somebody describe that to you, or did you? Yeah, it's probably not a bad idea. It's kind of like a guest house. You know, if Canada is the big house, then an Indian reservation or a reserve is a guest house. but it's not as nice. Often there's no plumbing and you have to boil your own water. And the government can move that house if they want to. Yeah, that's not a bad analogy there, Victoria. What's a band? What's an Indian band?
A body of Indians one whose skills and talent their income lands on the legal title to which is vested in Her Majesty at this Salmon.
Wow. Okay. What does that mean in kind of regular English to you? What does that mean?
Isn't like a legal title?
Okay. Has to do with land, but it also has to do with the title to the land, right? And it's kind of held by a group of indigenous people, right? So it's a way in which the government has kind of divided indigenous people into smaller groups that they can work with, right? And I've kind of given away part of that answer, but who creates bands? Or is it the government? Yeah, the government has in the past created bands, right? So
20th century, something like that.
what's that?
I think it's about 20th century, something like that.
Yeah. So the government has kind of divided First Nations people into groups in kind of whatever way has been convenient for them. Right? So if it's been better for the government to, divide them into smaller groups because they're easier to control, then the government did that, right? If it's easier for the government to deal with them in a big group because it's cheaper, then they were grouped together, right? And again, the government has the power to kind of do that. And so groups aren't, an Indian band isn't decided on by the group, they're decided on by the government, right? The government kind of groups them. And then they talk about how we can describe cultural or ethnic diversity in BC, and it's kind of complicated, right? So how have people tried to describe the cultural groups in BC? Tried to divide them according to what? Language is one way, right? Because there's probably 13 or 14? 30 or 40. Wow. 30 or 40 different languages spoken in BC alone. Right? So there's different languages. How else? Right? So people have tried to group them into sort of cultural groups, right? People with similar or the same kind of culture. What else? How else have they tried to? What's that? Territory, right? So they've tried to make geographic territories for people. What else? Oh, yeah. And then there's nations and communities and family groups, right? So it's really complicated, right? Because the way in which we might want to divide indigenous people isn't really the way they thought of themselves in the past, right? They didn't really divide themselves the way that we might try to divide them. And so when the government or when people who study indigenous people try to sort of categorize them, sometimes the categories don't make sense because they're not categories that come from indigenous culture, they're categories that come from European culture. And again, they just wouldn't have divided themselves out or thought of themselves as the same or different the same way that Europeans do, right? So again, there's a bit of a cultural difference, right? And sometimes it's a struggle to decide, how many different groups do you actually have in BC? Well, probably quite a number of them, right? But it's just, it's not clear how to sort of divide them up, right? So let me move on and give you just a little bit more, and then we'll have a break, okay? So we said that we're talking about these people we're talking about these people as the first people, right? The First Nations. And they are so because, again, they're the first people to show up in North America. So, again, if you go anywhere further back than about 12,000 years, you'll see that Earth is in an ice age, more climate change, right? That seems to come up quite a bit in cultures, but more climate change. And so this is actually what Canada looked like prior to 12,000 years ago. So those are all glaciers. Some of that ice is a kilometer thick, if you can believe it. You think it's cold here now. It's really cold. Well, it's frozen, right? The whole country is buried in ice prior to 12,000 years ago. And so really there are no people in North or South America at all, and there's really no way to get in, right? Because, let me just see if I have another map here. Oh yeah, because there are people over here in Asia, right? So humans evolved in Africa, they migrated out into Asia. So there were people all the way through here living and hunting and fishing and things. But basically when you got here, you couldn't really go any further because it was just ice, right? It was all frozen. And so people continued to kind of live in Asia for a long time until about 12,000 years ago. And then you get another climate change. Things start to warm up, right? The ice starts to melt, right? And because there's so much water trapped in the ice, right? All of that water is trapped in the ice. Sea levels are actually quite a bit lower than they are today. And so there's this kind of sweet spot. There's this period where the ice has started to melt, but the sea levels haven't come all the way up yet. So there's a time when you can actually walk right across from northeastern Russia, which is what that now is, into North America, right? Into what's now Alaska. And so people start to move in that way. They start to move along the coast, the west coast here in boats, and they start to filter into North and South America, right? And those are the ancestors of all indigenous people in North and South America. So do you remember our friends the Aztecs? You know, they were sacrificing people and pulling out their hearts. The Aztecs' ancestors come in this way as well, right? They enter North America around 11 or 12,000 years ago, okay? Yeah, so there's extra detail here. Again, people start to filter their way into North America, you know, starting around 12 or 13,000 years ago. So, yeah, you can sort of see there's a few different migrations, we think. Some people coming over the land, as I mentioned. Some people, you know, have boats, and so they kind of move along the coast, right? They move down that way and then head in later on. You can see we've got some archaeological dates there from 12,500 years ago to 13,500 years ago. Yeah, these are the first arrivals, right? The first people. We've also got some genetic evidence as well. So this is the same as, remember when we were watching the India video and they said that some people in southern India had the same genes that had come out of Africa in that first migration? Remember that? It was the M130 gene, is that correct? Yeah. So from those genes, you can kind of trace human migrations, right? So yeah, there was some people left and sort of found their way into India and kind of stayed there, but we can also trace other genetic groups as well. And so we can kind of figure out kind of who went where when, if you will. And so yeah, we can also trace the sort of arrival of people in North America, not only by archaeological sites, but also by their DNA, right? So these, you can see there's basically one or two big migrations into North America, right? You can see there's lots of different genetic groups in Asia, right? As people kind of branch off and leave Africa, and other people leave a little bit later. But here there's just a couple of migrations into North and South America. So again, these indigenous cultures are all distinct, but they're all kind of related as well, right? Because their ancestors arrive at the same time. Yeah, and so the first people to arrive here are hunter-gatherers, right? And we've talked about hunter-gatherers before. We've talked about, this is kind of maybe the classic image of the hunter. And, the first people to arrive here might have actually hunted animals like this. And so there were still mammoths, there was still the odd mammoth floating around in North America and maybe in, the northern parts of North America. There's a very famous, I think it's the leg bone of a mammoth, and there's a human spear point stuck in it. And it's from Washington State, which is just over the border. And I think it's from around 11,500 years ago or something. So there were still things like this wandering around here that people were hunting, right? So yeah, we know foragers, of course, gather their food from the natural world. We've talked about that before. They eat a broad variety of different foods. And again, this is, our original subsistence strategy, right? This is where we start out as humans. Okay, I don't want to go too long. Let's take a quick break, and then we will come back, okay? Yeah, we'll take a break, and then we'll come back. Right, we'll do that. Okay, take 10, people. Okay, people, we are back. So, again, we know that these first people to arrive in North America were foragers, right? They were hunter-gatherers. And we talked a lot about hunter-gatherers before, right? When we talked about prehistory. And those same things apply to the sort of ancestors of First Nations people here in North America, right? Again, we have really no written records from their earlier histories. These societies are non-literate, not illiterate, but non-literate. They don't write things down, right? They're not societies that developed a writing system, right? Most of these early people who came into North America didn't really have much stuff, right? They had their clothes and the tools they needed to hunt, and that's kind of it, right? And so because of that, they don't leave a lot behind for us to study. Also, what's that?
So they're not like a complex civilization.
So they're not like what?
Complex civilization.
No, these are simple foragers, kind of wandering the landscape, doing lots of hunting, mostly hunting really. They don't own a lot. They don't leave a lot behind. There probably weren't many people anyway. So, you know, when we think about people moving into North America 12,000 years ago, you know, don't imagine thousands of people pouring in there. You know, we're probably talking like, you know, maybe a few hundred people, like over the years, right? So they're really small groups that are moving in, right? So there's not many people coming through. They don't have a lot of stuff, and so archaeologically speaking, they're hard to see, right? They're hard to track. Yeah, some of them will kind of stay, some of them will continue to move down. Eventually people will find their way all the way to the southern part of South America, right? But it'll take some time, right? It'll take a couple thousand years maybe, but people will start to fill up North and South America. Again, they're moving around a lot. They're hunting and fishing and sort of just finding what food is available. They're not storing any food really. Again, they're just very mobile hunters is what they probably were. And again, I think you'll recall we said that this is really the key to survival as a hunter-gatherer, right? Your ability to move. Because the longer you stay in one place, the less food is available, right? You kind of keep eating the food that's around you, and then there becomes less of it. And then you kind of have to work harder to find more food. But food is always easy to find if you just keep moving, right? And so their mobility is kind of the secret, right? Food is always easy to find if you move to a place where you haven't been before, or you haven't been for a long time, right? Then it's much easier to find food than a place that you've been in for days or weeks or months, right? So, yeah, this is not a difficult way of life in terms of hard work, although I'm sure some of us look at that 15 to 20 kilometers a day and we're like, oh my God. But actually it's not that bad, especially if you're used to it. Yeah, and so these guys are quite successful doing this. They're quite well fed. They're very healthy. Yeah, and they survive, right? And again, this environment here in North and South America is very rich because there are no people here, right? It's totally open to them. Of course, we've got a wide variety of environments available here in North and South America, right? If you think of both of those continents, we've got Arctic snow and ice, we've got mountains, we've got plains, we've got jungles and rainforests, we've got deserts, we've got places that are next to the ocean, we've got places that are far inland. There's a huge diversity of environments, right? And again, those environments are going to influence the cultures of all of these people, just like we've seen the environment influence the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians and the Chinese. Everyone has been influenced by the environment they live in, and indigenous people definitely have been as well. Again, these are small groups, right? People know each other very well. Sometimes they may have got into conflict with each other, but probably not. If hunter-gatherers get in a disagreement, they usually just leave because they've got lots of space to move around. You know, why stay and fight someone? You can just go somewhere else, right? So most of the time they do. Their societies are egalitarian, right? So there are not big social hierarchies, certainly not like we saw in all of those civilizations, right? Most people have similar levels of power, although elders get a little more respect. People who have special skills might get a little more respect. Denise gets more respect. Some of those people, she's our human resources person. Yeah, so if you have special skills, but most people are kind of on the same level, right? They're thought of equally. Again, these people are experts in their environment. They're in excellent physical shape. They're well nourished. They don't work as many hours as we do today. And again, so hunter-gatherers have been called the original affluent culture, right? So affluent meaning wealthy, because they have everything they need and they don't have to work very much for it, right? So in a way, they are kind of rich, if you will. Yeah.
Be comfortable. I mean, if you just have products to give your money from them, take your money from the products, free products. I mean,
Uh-huh.
if they're freelance to gain your products from them, it's enough to live for your whole period of living. You don't have to work anymore to buy a new car.
Well, so how are you saying this? In ancient times or modern ones? Well, yeah, I mean, this is well before any of that stuff, right? This is well before any possessions or currency or money or any of that stuff, right?
And also, I think it was better.
Lots of people would agree with you. How do you feel it was better?
Because they were living, they were enjoying all the time. They were living in a calm situation. They were always relaxed. They can gain their food easily. Because nowadays, most of the people want to buy luxury cars, luxury houses.
Yeah.
And when they buy them,
Yeah.
they don't feel relaxed in them too.
Yeah.
Because they still have to work to buy something professional that they forgot.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's true, right? We have, we've become a society that's kind of obsessed with things, right? And acquiring those things because we think they'll make us happy or that's what we want, right? And it's interesting to think of these people who really had nothing because there was nothing, right? There were no things really except the things that you made with your own hands. And to be honest, they were probably perfectly satisfied and perfectly happy, right? And in some ways it was a simple time, right? There's no cities, there's no towns, there's no roads, there's no taxes, there's no warfare. Like these are all things that nobody's ever heard of, 10,000 years ago, right? Everyone is just moving around in small groups, hunting, fishing, having kids, raising those kids, living, dying, having fun. That's kind of all there is, right? So it's a much simpler level of kind of existence than we live now, right? We live a very complicated, sometimes stressful existence, right? Yeah, it's interesting to think about what their lives might have been like, but it's also, I think, sometimes very difficult to imagine that level of simplicity, right? I find it difficult sometimes, but yeah. So we mentioned this already for indigenous people here in BC. Lots of variability, right? Lots of different languages spoken, lots of different cultures and religions and practices. Yeah, so First Nations are not a single group, they're actually a collection of different groups. And really, they're only put in a group because to contrast them from non-Indigenous Canadians, right? So, oh yeah, I did want to show you this. So this is one way of dividing up the First Nations people in British Columbia. And so this is, I think, primarily linguistic. So this is based on the different languages. And as you can see, this is only in one part of British Columbia. This is like half of British Columbia. And you can see a good 12 or maybe 13 different languages, which is unbelievable, right? So much cultural and language diversity in just a small place. And so here you can see, you'll remember we talked about the Kwakwaka'wakw before, right? They're in the green there at the top of Vancouver Island. Currently we're in territory that were, traditionally the people who lived here were called Coast Salish, okay? So the Coast Salish people live here, and then within that language group there were smaller cultures as well. So Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and shoot, who's the other one? I should know this. Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and the, damn it, there's a third one, but there's 3 smaller cultures that live in this area as well. Okay. But yeah, you can see quite a bit of linguistic diversity. All of these people, all of these cultures have similarities, but they're also different as well. Okay. So yeah, I think I was happy to hear Felicia bring up the idea of simple versus complex foragers, because the people who kind of arrive here, the first people to arrive here 10 or 12,000 years ago, are simple foragers. And many groups kind of stay that way, right? They continue to be very mobile, and depending on where they live, they remain simple foragers or simple hunter-gatherers. But interestingly, here on the coast, on the West Coast, there's so much food available that some people get to develop into complex foragers, right? And you'll remember that we said complex foragers tend to stay in one place for a longer period of time. They tend to live in larger numbers. They tend to store their food, particularly during the winter. They tend to have status differences, right? Again, not like a civilization like ancient Egypt, nothing that big, but there are status differences in the community. Some people have more power than others. They have stuff. They have things, right? Because they don't move around very much, they can actually accumulate belongings, right? They can actually have things. And so, they're a little bit different than simple foragers. But yeah, it's another kind of interesting way to live, right? Yeah, and so again, by about 10,000 years ago, most of the glaciers had melted away. British Columbia was now exposed, right? It wasn't covered in ice anymore. And people could kind of find their way into this area and start to live, right? And so again, the ancestors of indigenous people today found their way into this part of the world about 10,000 years ago and have been living here ever since and continue to live here, right? And that's a really long history, right? It's a really long history. Yeah, so we've said that, simple foragers. Right. And of course, the earliest people in this part of the world are still doing that. They're still being simple foragers, still moving around. They haven't quite settled down and started to develop into complex foragers just yet. Okay. Again, population density is low. There's not that many people in BC 10,000 years ago, very small groups. But it's around 5,000 to 3,000 years ago that things really start to get more complex, okay? And they start to get complex because of salmon, okay? Salmon are the things that allow indigenous people in this part of the world to move from simple foraging to a more complex subsistence strategy. And it's what allows them to live in one place for longer. It's what allows their populations to grow higher. It's really the salmon that they have to thank for that. And yeah, I'm just going to jump ahead here. So that's a salmon, of course. You've probably seen salmon in the stores, right? It's a big fish. Sometimes they look like this or a little bit different. Their flesh is kind of pink colored, right? They are quite delicious. If you're into, anybody like salmon? Oh, really? Yeah. What about like raw salmon with sushi? Also good? I'm still getting used to that. I'm still getting used to the raw fish thing. I like it, but I'm kind of like, sometimes. But very tasty fish. And maybe this is the last thing I'll say because I want to hand this out to you. Right. This is the resource. This is the food resource that allows these people to become more complex foragers. And the reason for it, and I think we might have mentioned this earlier, but if we didn't, forgive me. In the fall, in October usually, these fish come back into the rivers of British Columbia. So they're usually born here, so their parents lay a bunch of eggs here. They hatch, they grow up, and they swim out into the ocean. And these fish live their lives in the ocean. And then when it's time for them to lay eggs, they swim back up the rivers of BC. And in many cases, they come right back to the same river that they were born in. How they do this, I have no idea, but somehow they know, and they return to the same river that they were born in. They lay their eggs, and then they die. And that's kind of it for them. But when this happens, there are huge numbers of salmon coming up the rivers. And so indigenous people would have been ready to get as many salmon as they could so that they could dry them and store them away for winter, right? And again, in October, there's just tons of salmon that still come up the rivers. And so you can imagine thousands of years ago with no humans around, there would have been lots of food, right? Lots and lots of fish. And people still, yeah, so you can see that's a modern picture today. Those are salmon that are all kind of waiting to lay their eggs. And you could imagine if you had a big net or a bunch of spears or something, you could very easily catch a bunch of those, right? And lots of, modern fishermen continue to, go to the rivers of British Columbia and catch these fish today. Like that guy, that's my dad actually. But so people still continue to catch these fish today, right? Okay, so I'm gonna leave it there, and what I'd like to do is I'd like to give you this permission slip for our field trip on Friday, okay? So if you are 19 years of age or older, you don't need permission from anyone to go, okay? You can just go. But what I do need from you is an emergency contact, okay? So if we're on the field trip and somehow you die or I kill you, that won't happen. Maybe. If either of those things happens, I need to know who to call, right? So I need a phone number of someone responsible, a homestay person, somebody I can talk to, okay? And again, preferably somebody who speaks at least some English, okay? Don't give me the, don't, well, you laugh, but in the past, like somebody said emergency contact name and they've written it in Mandarin. I'm like, I don't know what that is. You gotta give me someone who speaks at least some English, okay? So if you're over 19, I don't need permission, I just need emergency contact. If you're under 19, I need your parent or legal guardian to sign off on it, okay? So I will give this to you and then, what's that? No, you have to go.
You have a assignment for that.
Yes.
What I did.
I'm in the process of writing it, but you will have an assignment.
Right hand side or no?
It remains to be seen. It'll probably be, I'll probably do it on Teams because then you'll be able to do it while you're there with your phone kind of thing. Yeah, probably be like that. So, I'm going to hand this out to you. Bring it back to me again if you're over 19. If you're over 19, just give me an emergency contact. If you're under 19, I need an emergency contact and I need a guardian or a parent to sign it. Okay?
Well, let's start together. You will laugh at me.
So, yes. Can you bring it back to me tomorrow? What's that? No.
Pay for that.
Yes.
Yes, and so we can talk about that tomorrow too. It's going to cost you $6. Again, if the and you pay that to me. If that's a problem for you, if you cannot pay $6, come talk to me and we'll try to work something out.
Can we use it?
I think so, but let me just, let's deal with that tomorrow, okay? But yeah, bring this back to me tomorrow, signed, and that way.
So what about final?
What about what?
Final exam.
We'll deal with that tomorrow too. I've got one or two things to finish up with that. So, that is all for today. Bring me that sign tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll talk about money and we'll talk about final project assignment thing. So that's all. Thanks, Kayla. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.